And once again, thanks all the Data Toboggan team. And for those of you watching back the recording, sorry I can't help you in the chat, but hopefully you get something out of it and my contact details will be there. For those of you joining live, thanks for joining us today on whatever day it is for you and whatever hour of the day it is for you. But we're going to talk all about sensitivity labels in Microsoft Fabric. And there's like 46 slides to cover in less than 45 minutes. So I will try not to talk too fast because I'm aware of my accent, but we'll race through. So my name's Heidi Hasting. By day, I'm a data analytics consultant in Australia. I live in South Australia, so that's in the middle down the bottom, if for those of you who've never seen the Australian geography. And then I do all things data, but in my former life, I was a software developer. So I just have a knack for loving all things about source control. And I went on a bit of a gamification process the last couple of years and decided to get a whole bunch of certs. So these are just some of them. If you want to know about certs, reach out to me. I'm happy to try and help. And of course, hit me up on socials. And I corrected my link because I put the wrong link in. For some reason, I was thinking it was www, but it's actually HTTPS. So anyway, let's get into today's content. So we're going to talk about what are sensitivity labels. I'm going to tell you about the licensing considerations because, yes, this is another feature that needs a license. I'm going to show you roughly how to set them up and how to use them and where you can see them specifically within Microsoft Fabric and a little bit about the auditing aspect that is available within Microsoft Fabric. So first and foremost, what are sensitivity labels? They used to just be a label when it came to Microsoft Fabric. Now they're a label with a little bit of security attached to them. If you've ever heard of people say Microsoft Information Protection, that's one and one the same. So sometimes it's referred to as MIP or Microsoft Information Protection. A lot of the times on the user interface, you'll see the sensitivity labels. It is different to classification. So if you see classification, that's slightly different. So you want to make sure when you're looking at this, you're looking at sensitivity label. But it does provide the ability to label a piece of, it's like an extra bit of metadata. So you can apply a label to your data sets, to your reports, to your dashboards, to your pipelines, all the different things that we can use within Microsoft Fabric, with the exception of workbooks, which if you're not familiar with workbooks, that's Excel files published up to the service. And it is that extra piece of metadata. The thing I love about this in particular is you see it in the list view and the lineage view, but it also is incorporated if using things like Microsoft Purview, Data Map, and Unified Catalog. You'll see the sensitivity label information over there. In terms of licensing, you do need either information protection plans P1 or P2, or the more common thing that people will have is a single E5 license for 365. So one singular E5 license will enable the ability to create a sensitivity label. And I'll show you about the where and the how. The other thing on the flip side, if you want to use it within Power BI items specifically, so think reports, dashboards, data mart, data flow gen 1, that sort of thing, you need Power BI Pro licensing or premium per user. The capacity one is covered as well. But those are the main things you need from a licensing standpoint. And I'll show you what sort of happens if you don't have them. And I'll show you what happens if you have them, but you don't have access to the label later in the deck. So talking about how to set up sensitivity labels, Microsoft gives us this nice little three-step process, which for reference is done within Microsoft Purview, formerly the Office 365 Risk and Compliance Center within the Office 365 Admin Center. But now that comes under the umbrella of Microsoft Purview. Not to be confused with formerly, Azure Purview, that got kind of combined with Microsoft Purview, and now they got the one name. It's confusing to no end. But basically, you create the label. When you're creating the label, you have a series of settings, and I'll talk to you about them in the next couple of slides. Once you've created a label, just creating it alone doesn't make it available. It's just creating it, right? So it just sits in a list effectively. Once you have the label, you've got to publish a policy. That policy defines who can use the label in what scenario and a couple of extra restrictions, whether or not encryption is applied, whether offline access is available, and things like that. Then skipping the end user can then use that label once the policy is applied. If they're in the list of users with access to that label through the policy, they can then use it. And then separately, some solutions can enforce a level of protection. And I'll talk to that in more detail soon. So basically how to set up the label. We start off with the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and I wanted to include these screens because often The M365 Admin Center is not often where the data professional plays. So you're probably looking to talk to either your global admin, your cloud admin, or whoever's responsible for the admin center. In some cases, Microsoft Purview now falls within security teams. So if it's not your data team and you're not fortunate enough to get access, this is the information you want to know so you can work with those people to get this set up. So once we're in the admin centers list, we're going to go into Microsoft Purview. And then within Microsoft Purview, you want to go into information protection and then sensitivity labels. So within that sensitivity labels area, you will then see a screen like this, which gives you the list of labels. So this is kind of that list I was talking about before. It's not the policies, it's just the labels. So here you start off with a blank slate and there's no labels defined. So there's no pre-inbuilt standards. So if, for example, in Australia, we have federal standards called IRAP, for a lot of government agencies, it's not predisposed to have those. Organizations in Europe who have, GDPR, it doesn't have that automatically in here, or any other label strategy you want. Something to be mindful of with labels in this space, whilst we're looking at them as a data professional, your organization is using them in more than just your data estate. So a sensitivity label can apply to emails, SharePoint, Teams, files, storage accounts, Azure SQL, SQL Server on-prem, and a whole host of other things in addition to Microsoft Fabric. So the labels that you define here are widely used across your organization. So don't think about them as just labels you're using in your data estate space, but what you're using across your entire organization. The ones you'll see in mine are completely fictional, and I use NCIS as my base purely because I remember the teams, and so I have test users with the same names as the characters. So once we've set up some labels, there is also a priority ranking on the label. Why is a priority ranking necessary? For solutions like Fabric and Power BI, where you could have a data set that has one label, another data set that has another label, you bring both those data sets into a report. What label does the report then show? The priority ordering will determine which label to apply to the Power BI report, as opposed to you necessarily having to pick one, but also it gives Microsoft a way to determine what the priority is. Also with the labels, we have things like scope, we have who created them, we have another few properties. So some of the things we can do is define a label and a description. That's the information that's going to be visible to our end user when they're trying to apply the label. They'll see the label name. When they hover over the label, they'll see a brief description. We also get to define its scope, whether that label applies to things like Purview or Power BI Fabric, or whether it only applies to SharePoint sites and Teams. We can then define protection for the files. Protection doesn't apply to all data estate assets. So up until probably the last, I want to say 6 to 12 months, encrypt didn't appear, or control access plane didn't appear. So when you're working with PBIX files, even if they had a label, you could open them regardless of whether you had permission to use that label or not. If you had access to the workspace, you can go in and view the report regardless of whether you have access to the label. So that's where that security mechanism plays a part. It's not always there for a lot of the Fabric items. We can determine online and offline access. So offline doesn't apply to the Power BI Fabric world. It does apply to things like files in SharePoint and things like emails. When we publish the labels, we define what the label is that we're publishing. We can also define who has access to modify and update that label. And then we have certain policy settings we can apply as well. So when you're post-defining the label, you define the policy. Within the policy, you specify who can access that label. So you can have users, groups, or a combination of the two. And you can also determine mandatory requirements. So in the case of Fabric, you can set a default label. So all items within Fabric have to have a default label, and you define what that label is. You can also define options that say, okay, if someone's going to downgrade the label from one, like a higher priority to a lower priority, then you can require them to put a justification in as to why they're doing it. So for example, if you're ordering of priority, let's say confidential was the highest priority and public was the lowest. If someone was to change a Fabric item from confidential to public, they would have to specify the why, and that why would go into the Office 365 activity logs. Once we've created and published our label, We now need to be able to use it on the fabric world. We can't just go ahead and use it. This makes it available so we can see it, but that's kind of it. And if no one's defined labels, you won't be enabled. The sensitivity label button within things like Power BI Desktop won't be enabled, and the drop down within the settings on the fabric items will just show nothing. So within Fabric itself, we have a number of tenant admin settings. They don't appear under a sensitivity label, they appear under information protection. So that's why it's good to know that they're one and the same thing. Within this, we can allow users to apply sensitivity labels for content. So that's the first step that we want to do to enable our users to be able to apply a sensitivity label. They can apply it within Power BI Desktop without this setting being enabled, but they can't publish it. So we want to make sure that this is enabled on the tenant, and that way people can use sensitivity labels within our tenant. We can define it as either the entire organization has the access, or we can restrict it to only a subset. So we can enable it for a specific set of security groups or by exception. So entire org with the exception of a specific security group, or specific security group with the exception of another specific security group. So that way, if you wanted to pilot the use of information protection labels and sensitivity labels, you can then choose to pilot it with a subset of users before you enable it for the wider users. And you'll already see in these that when you do things like export to Excel, that's one that does apply a control in place to a label. So if you don't have access to the label and you export to Excel, you just get a nice little error message that says you don't have access, and it won't show you the data, except for the fact you've already viewed the data in the Power BI report. So it's great that Excel applied some controls. Power BI just went, yep, you've got access to the workspace or the report. You can go and look at everything. Doesn't use the label for a blocker. The other thing we might want to do is actually automatically apply sensitivity labels to downstream content. So that's the scenario where you've got data sets or semantic models, and you're going to use them in reports, or reports that you're then going to use in dashboards. So that way you can automatically apply the sensitivity label from the area of data set that you're going to pull the data from, and then have that appear. So that way, if someone creates a report from, say, a semantic model with confidential, the report automatically gets confidential. That's kind of handy because a lot of users when they're doing things in this space, because it is a governance thing, they're kind of like, I don't know what label to apply. They may mislabel the information, which is quite common. They might they're not sure, so they just put the highest restrictive label in place without understanding what the labels are doing behind the scenes. So having that ability to automatically apply a sensitivity label gives you that aspect of, okay, my users aren't sure, let me automatically apply something, then they can modify it after the fact. And there's other options like restricting the ability to share it, encrypting published files, and then, being able to apply from data sources. Now, the sensitivity labels from data sources only works if your data sources are ones that have sensitivity labels available to them. Now that we've done all those tenant settings, just to get us started with using them, so I don't use the other ones so much in my little demo tenant, but those ones are key. When we talk about the Power BI items, not everything allows us to use sensitivity labels. So workbooks is a no-no. I don't know whether I think that's kind of like unfortunate, really, because Excel, which is where the workbook comes from, allows you to apply sensitivity labels. So you can apply a sensitivity label in Excel. You can upload that to the service, and the service will just show dash for the sensitivity label, unfortunately. And then when you scan it into Purview as a data asset, it will also not show the sensitivity label, which is a bit unfortunate. But we do get to use it with dashboards and reports and data marts and data sets and data flows. Now, with paginated reports, the reason I put a little asterisk there is because with all the others, with the exception of dashboard, right, and data mart, you can do them within Power BI Desktop. Paginated reports, even though it has the Power BI report builder or Visual Studio, whichever one you're using, you can't actually apply a sensitivity label from either of those interfaces. So you actually have to publish the report to the service and then go into the settings and modify the label from there. The other thing, how do we actually apply the label? So within Power BI Desktop, on the left-hand side, this is what it looks like. It's in the ribbon, so top right of Power BI Desktop. It'll say sensitivity. Now, if it's grayed out, so it's just got that sort of overlay of not enabled looking thing, then that means either your tenant doesn't have any sensitivity labels set up, you're not logged in. So when you first open Power BI Desktop, you're not automatically logged in unless you've done it before. So you need to go to the top right where it's got the little avatar, make sure you sign in at the appropriate account, or it's not enabled on the tenant. You don't have a label. You don't have access to a label on that tenant. So make sure that when you are working with Power BI Desktop and you're working with multiple tenants, that you log into the correct one to apply the label to. Because unfortunate things happen when you log into the wrong tenant and then publish that. And you see this often with PowerPoint files. I don't know if you've watched a number of presentations out there in the world, but sometimes people will make the PowerPoint file available to the audience. They'll forget to take the information protection labels off, and then you can't open it. So that happens a lot. Power BI is no different, that you want to define that access appropriately and use the right accounts accordingly. So once you do have it logged in and have a label defined and you've got access to that label, then on the right hand side is what your experience will look like. You can click the little sensitivity button and then it'll show the list of labels. Now that GUI changes ever so slightly over time. So I think at the moment it'll show the label name, then it'll show a little shield icon, and then the shield may be a color because you can define a color for a label. Very rudimentary color list. I think there's only about 8 different colors you can pick from, but that's another option when you're defining the label. Now that we've set one up, where do we set? So if I go in and pick confidential, the first thing that's going to happen is the little status bar area down the bottom is going to show the sensitivity label there. So it's going to show confidential. Now when I publish it to the service in list view, I'm going to see it in the sensitivity column. That's a column that appears in list view by default. If you're not using labels, it'll just be blank. As soon as you start using labels, you'll see the label name there. If we go into lineage view, it used to look like this, and I show this because now it looks more like this one. So just the icons have changed really. You get little shields. Now, if you hover over those shields, it'll show you to you the label name for the label that's been applied. If we're in an actual item, within the item, we'll be able to see in the top left of screen. So it used to be here next to the report name, you would see what the sensitivity label is. Now you actually see it on the left hand side with the fabric interface. So you see it's still next to the report name, but it'll be the first thing you see after the little pipe symbol. And if you go ahead and hit the drop down arrow, you'll see more details about the report. You get that card visual. So inside that you see the sensitivity label as well. And if I want to change it, when I'm viewing an item, if I want to change the item, I can simply click it from there. It's an editable drop-down, or I can go into the settings. So that's how you see it for a report, and prepare to have like Groundhog Day as we go through the other items because they're very, very similar. So with a data mart, now a data mart, even though it consists of a number of columns and tables, unfortunately, all sensitivity labels within Fabric are at the item level. So unlike things like Azure SQL and SQL Server, where you can do it down to the column level, you can't do that with Fabric items. So be conscious of if your item contains a number of different sensitivity labels. So you might have some public data, some sensitive data, some confidential data. You have to consider that as a whole, what would you label that within your organization? I've worked in organizations where it's usually the combination of and the risk level, and then a risk level of a certain type can introduce at one higher level of classification. So if you had multiple details, say 360 of a person, their address, social security card number, credit card number, ABN, any sort of identifier, their date of birth, any of the PI, plus you had a number of other things about them, combined in that one data mart, that may elevate the sensitivity to a higher level just by nature of having multiple pieces of information at a lower level. So that's what we do for data mart. And then when we go into a data mart, we can actually go into the settings of the data mart. And then within settings, about halfway down, you'll see sensitivity label, and you can select confidential or any other label you want. Now, as with before, the user that's logged into the service at the time, that is what the list drop-down will apply. So it will show you just the list you have access to. So if you're like myself and you run multiple accounts, say an admin account and a normal account, make sure you're logged in with the correct account to apply the correct labeling. The sad part, it doesn't actually restrict access to the contents. but it does apply the label from a visibility standpoint. So you have that label in place so you can use it to indicate to your users what the sensitivity of the information they're viewing is. Now with Dataflow Gen 1 or Dataflow Gen 2, with the fabric side of the fence and pipeline, we can also see it in the settings. So when you go into the settings, you'll see sensitivity label, and just like before, you'll be able to pick the sensitivity label for that particular item and apply it, and then it will appear in list and lineage view and in that, header bit right up the top and in the settings so you can modify it. And apologies, I haven't checked if it comes out in the APIs. That's something I haven't tested. With data engineering, so for a lakehouse, you can apply it. For the lakehouse SQL endpoint, you don't get to edit it. So the SQL endpoint takes the value from the lakehouse itself. And then for a notebook, you can also apply a sensitivity label onto a notebook. With warehouse, we can apply it as we did with the others. And here's an example of what the coloring can look like. Now, I don't recommend solely using coloring in case you've got anyone with visual or color blindness. You want to be cautious of using coloring to indicate anything, but it is an option that's available to you. And then within the warehouse properties, you see it. And same as Lakehouse, the warehouse SQL endpoint will not change. It will take the value from the warehouse itself. Now, what happens if we then try and export some of this information? If we try and export it to Excel, if we do not have access to the label. So if I've got access to the report, I can see the report. But as soon as I try to export, the control shifts to Excel, and Excel can actually check whether you've got access to a label. So if you get this error message saying you're not signed in with an account that has permissions to access it, it's because you don't have permissions to access the label. Now, that could just be because you've logged in with the wrong account in Excel, or you're running multiple accounts. So you can just change your sign in, or it could be you don't have access to the label. So that's both good that we have that level of control, but bad because it would be nice if Power BI was also able to take that into account. As I said earlier, the whole Excel thing, yeah, it just doesn't show up, which is a bit of a shame, unfortunately. Bit of a shame. But I think workbooks are getting less and less features and functionality, so probably steer clear of them going forward. How to apply them downstream. So if we've got a semantic model, you can see here we've got a semantic model with confidential. I go ahead and say I want to build a report off that, and you can see straight away Microsoft tells us this data set sensitivity label is confidential, so we'll automatically apply it to your new report, and they let you know before you hit the save button. So we're already applying them to downstream. If we didn't have that tenant setting on, we wouldn't get this behavior, but this is kind of a nice feature to have on as a sort of starting point when you're working with labels. Now, if we're using them in Excel, because Excel has the ability to take data from Power BI, that whole golden data set functionality. If we do that, we're very fortunate in that it will let us know that the data set we're trying to connect to has a sensitivity label applied to it and what that label is. So this is where it's important to put a good description in your labels so that people understand potentially why they can't access something. And I forgot to mention, when you're doing the labels and the policy, you have the ability to put an admin only description in there as well. So you can put some notes around like who has access to modify it, who's authorized to change it, potentially a link to a SharePoint site that describes the labeling that you're using within your org. Once we have picked our label and we've picked our data set, then Excel is smart enough to know that, hey, this has got a sensitivity label applied to it, so it's going to tell you that and then apply it to the Excel file. So it will also appear in the status bar and in the sensitivity dropdown on the Excel file. So you can see there it's already put for my book 4 that it's confidential because the data set I try to connect to is confidential. Now, what's changed recently? So in case you watched my presentation last year, you would have seen some of this already, but this is the new stuff, right? So PBIX and PBIP, PBIR, right? PBIX, if the sensitivity label has been set up so that it is a control access label. With a control access label, it's some of the settings as you're going through creating the label. If you go and create a report, so this one I have a label applied that's restricted to my good friend Abby. And then with that, if I go take that file in Power BI and I download a copy of it, so I've got the PBIX straight from the service. If I open it up as Abby, all good. Opens, no problem. No errors, no nothing. Now, if if it's a label that doesn't have the control access set up, this is what's going to happen. Denozo goes and opens the Power BI desktop file, that PBIX. It opens without error because control access was not defined when the label was created. And in this case, Denozo also can't see the sensitivity dropdown. That's because they don't have a Power BI Pro license. So not because of the label, just because they don't have Pro, so they can't use the labeling functionality. It's very confusing. Now, if we go back to our tenant area and we go ahead and enable some of these access controls. So we need to set some of the settings that allows us to use controls. So these will activate what's called the RMS for our tenant and allow us to use the encryption and sensitivity labels across the service. So I've just done it in PowerShell, mainly because that's what Microsoft instructions say to do. I don't know if there's a GUI option to do it, because often with these things, I just follow the one in the docs first before I go apply a different one. And in this case, they don't provide a GUI reference. They go straight for scripting, which makes me think it's not a GUI thing. So then now that I've got the control plane attached, so in this case, I've got a label called control access label. I wouldn't legitimately use that in a company. I just use it to make it easier for me to understand what I was using. So now if I publish that same Power BI report, I'll do it as Abby because she's got access to the label. So I upload the Power BI report to the service. It's visible. Abby can see it. You can see in the list view, it's all there. The control access label's there. Now, what happens in scenarios where people don't have access to the label? So my other account, my Denozo account, now tries to open this Power BI desktop file, which has that control label applied. Now they cannot open the PBIX, not to be confused with PBIP, PBIR space. They cannot open the PBIX because it has a protection applied, and Power BI desktop now recognizes that there is a protection element applied. What happens if I'm a user that gets a Power BI desktop file who doesn't have access to the label, but has access to the ability to import within the service? If you try and import within the service and you're using an account that doesn't have access to the label, it will block the upload. So you can't upload a report. That's another thing to be aware of. Oh, I raced through this super quick. We've got oodles of time. Git integration. Now, this is where the PBIP, PBIR is coming into play. So if you've got a workspace and you integrate it with Git, for those of you who've not seen this, I'm only describing this at a high level, but if you go into the workspace settings and you go in Git integration, whether you pick Azure DevOps or whether you pick GitHub, is here nor there. But what happens is your workspace contents goes into a repository in the relevant platform. So in my case, Azure DevOps. Now, what happens is basically it's taking those Power BI reports and putting them in as PBIPs. Now, those are just files, right? So there's no protection at that point because as far as Azure DevOps is concerned, it's a series of files, a bit like the Power BI workspace. It's just a file with a label. It doesn't really treat it as a security mechanism. So the sensitivity label is there in the service, but in source control, it won't really use it. So if I've got access to this repo in Azure DevOps, I can go in and look at the PBIR and everything in the PBIP contents. I can download them. I can open them. It's not restricted because it's just a text file at that point. So it doesn't really, how is Azure DevOps going to know that it's got a label? And then how's it going to know to restrict access to the label? And GitHub is an entirely different thing because GitHub accessing something like labels. The labels are defined in Microsoft Purview. GitHub, different platform. Azure DevOps with the entry integration. So it's important to note that as soon as you do things like PBIPs, it's not going to block someone from being able to access it. So while it's in the PBIX context and it's a control access label, then yes, it can stop someone from opening the PBIX. Why might that be important? Potentially, if the file gets left somewhere and someone gets to it and you don't want people to access it, then using that control plane with the encrypt restriction, great. Or, people are emailing around the Power BI file and it's in import mode. Not great. So unfortunately, you got to sort of do the trade-off. As soon as you put it in the PBIP format, which is awesome, we can do all these things with it, but we can't use the sensitivity label as a blocker to accessing that information. So that's something to be aware of, is that while it's in PBIX format, you got a level of control, and with Excel, you got a level of control. All the other formats treat it like a text file. Now, that just depends on how you're using labeling. The hard part is sensitivity labels apply across so many things within an org. So in email, it'll do one thing. So you can like block sharing, you can block visibility of an email. Files in SharePoint, similar. You can block access to the SharePoint, you can block access to the file, you can block access to having it offline, like downloading it locally, and then how long, if they have downloaded it, how long before it rechecks do they have access. Power BI, not so much. So it gets a bit confusing because you'll have people who go, oh, we got this label and we got all these protections. They apply only to platforms and products that can apply security for those protections. When it comes to Fabric and Power BI, it can't apply the same, it doesn't have that defined within the feature set. So it can't do the same controls. Similar to the, in Azure SQL, we can do down to the column. Fabric, we can't. I hope one day we can, but at the moment we can't. So we've got a little bit of functionality, but it's also confusing because you almost want like a little spaghetti diagram of if this, then that. If this, you can do this. If this, you can do this. So it gets very confusing, especially when you're working across a number of products. So to show what it'll look like for a user, if I go add my Denozo user into my Git repo, so Denozo's got no access on the workspace. He's got nothing, but he's got access to the ADO project and the Git repo, so he can go in and look at my ABI sensitivity report. He can even take a copy and publish it somewhere, or take a copy offline. So there's no real blocker there. So it's just something to be aware of, because you might want to use it as a blocking feature, but unfortunately the option's not there. Now, how to monitor. So one way to monitor within the Fabric service is the Purview Hub. So not to be confused with the full-blown Microsoft Purview data catalog and data map and Unity catalog. This is the Purview Hub. It's like a really lightweight version for people to get started on, but it means you don't have to have the full-blown Purview itself. But as soon as you've got the sensitivity labels on your tenant, well, you can use this without that, but once you do have those labels and you go into the Purview Hub, which exists within the admin monitoring workspace, so it's not available to everyone, unfortunately, but it is available to your admins, they can go in and see how many items have sensitivity labels applied across the whole tenant. You can also go and search for particular items. You might want to see, hey, we're doing an audit of our organization, how many items have a sensitivity label applied, or we recently did some training, we've been piloting it, is it working? What you tend to find is if people are highly, unsure, you'll often get one label used so often, and then you sort of got to realize that, hang on, if every single item has the exact same label, either we have a default policy applied or we have a number of users who are unsure of how to use the labeling feature, so they just default it to something. And often they'll default it to something really restrictive just because they don't want to be the one to get it wrong. But that's a good thing to audit every so often, maybe like every 3 to 6 months, or if you've got a governance team, try and provide them this information on a regular basis so that they can improve the training within the group. Or as you're doing pilots, you can see how effective it is, increase the training, come back and look at the effectiveness and determine whether or not more training is needed or less. We can look at more detail so we can see by item type the number of items we have against the number of items that have been labeled, and there is a threshold where it allows you to say, hey, in my case, I've set the coverage threshold of 90%, and so it's letting me know that, there's a significant portion of your tenant that is not there. Unfortunately, the item types, like you see Synapse Notebook there, they don't one-for-one match the name you see on the item, so just be conscious of the item type in here. It will be close, but not necessarily the same. So like a mirrored Cosmos or mirrored Azure SQL, I think what is the other one, mirrored Snowflake, they will have a slightly different name to the item type name. So, or the item name you see when you're going to create new items. So just be conscious of that, but they're fairly close, so you can kind of guesswork it out. But it's also another option when you're doing that audit. If you do have someone externally audit your organization, you can come in and say, look, we've got an X proportion of our inventory within the service is labeled. And then you can go as far as going, okay, these ones aren't labeled. Why aren't they labeled? Okay, it's a team doing a proof of concept, or it's a development area, or it's a training area. So it's not necessarily going to be labeled, but these other areas, these other workspaces, these are mandatory that we have some labels. We couldn't use the mandatory feature, but we do have the ability to look here and go, okay, doing an audit, this team's going well, that team might need some more education, or hey, maybe we don't default labels, maybe we turn it off, but we make it mandatory to have a label. And that way we've got a level of control, but we force the users to understand how to apply labels. And of course, if you do introduce Microsoft Purview and you scan the Fabric item, so you can scan an entire Fabric tenant, or you can scan a subset of workspaces. You can do what's called a scope scan. Now, it will show the items, and now there is a level to which it doesn't work, which is when you're doing Lakehouse tables. I forget the exact reasoning for that. I think you have to have one of the preview features on the Lakehouse in order for the Purview scan to show the tables. But at the item level, you can see items. So you can see things like pipelines, and it'll show that they have a sensitivity label applied. And you can do the classification concept, which exists within Purview, but it's not one-to-one with the sensitivity label you see, which is why some people will refer to sensitivity labels and information protection as classification or classifying. It is classifying information to apply a label, but it's not the same as the Purview classification concept within the data asset stuff. If we're in the Purview portal and we go to the audit log, so this used to be things like the Office 365 audit log, we can go through and search for things like where a sensitivity label has been applied, changed, deleted. So remember we talked about that justification concept where if someone has to justify that they've downgraded a label or removed a label entirely, this is where you're going to find that information to be able to search so that you can look for it. Now, I've got oodles of time left. So, whilst I am finished the content, because I've raced through that information,